My name is Adam Harris. I'm a lecturer in experimental psychology. I specialise in the general area of judgment and decision making, and I'm based here in Bedford Way. I'm predominantly interested in, I guess all of my research to some degree falls around the question of how we estimate risk, how we perceive risk, and then also related to that, how we can communicate risk such that people perceive it better and make the right decisions. Some time ago, we found that people actually overestimated bad things relative to neutral things. So if you give people two scenarios, in one of them nothing's really going to happen that's going to be bad, but in another scenario something really bad is going to happen, they estimate the probability of the second one is higher than the first one, with everything else being equal. And this was somewhat surprising given a general tendency in the literature to assume that people are optimistic. So there's an overall finding that people are unrealistically optimistic. That is, they think that bad things are less likely to happen to themselves than to other people. So that led us to go off and look at that literature in slightly more detail, and we've taken a general strategy of various experimental techniques, but also simulation techniques. So we've looked at the methods that have been used in that literature, which uses a very statistical approach in the first place. So what they do is they say, well, we don't know how likely it is that Adam Harris is going to have a heart attack. What we can do is we can look at a huge group of people, or a large group of people, and we can say, how likely do you think you are to have a heart attack compared with the average person? And then we can aggregate across all those responses, and we can say, well, the average of everybody's response should be the average. That kind of makes sense. And that's true. In principle, that works. In practice, what we found through various different reasons, which I won't go into now, in practice, the results show, or the test falls down on the fact that perfectly rational, accurate individuals can provide responses on these scales and look optimistic. So this is what I mean by simulation work. We can actually we can pretend that everybody's perfectly rational, or we can pretend that everybody knows exactly what's going to happen to them at any particular time. Plug that into the questionnaires that are often used, analyse the data, and show, hold on, this looks like these guys are optimistic. So if we're finding that those guys look optimistic, and finding that humans look optimistic, we can no longer make the same conclusion in that way. So for a while I've been pushing really at this question of how real, how genuine is optimism as a trait of the way in which we interpret the likelihood of events, or the risk of events, in other words. And so I'm not going to sit here and say optimism definitely doesn't exist. What I am going to say is that the evidence for optimism is far less strong than we've previously been thought in the literature. And in particular, it seems as though if it does exist, it's probably being driven by other effects. So it's not just the fact that I want something, therefore I think it's going to happen. There's more what we call mediators. There are more underlying mechanisms that might be related to, for example, thinking about myself more than other people and having a sort of biased amount of information, but in a way that's not directly driven by a sort of I wish for, therefore I believe mechanism, what you might call genuine optimism. In addition, we're interested in what people perceive as risk and communication of risk. Often we receive information from testimony. So we find out what our chances of overall having a heart attack might be from the doctor, or from the newspaper, or from an academic journal. And so, as well as just looking at these sort of statistical arguments as to what's going on in optimism, I'm also interested in how we respond to testimony. So that might be whether we're responsive to factors such as the reliability of the source, the independence of different sources, and also, for example, how the information is conveyed. But do we do better in our perception of risk if we receive it? Are we more accurate in our perception of risk if we receive it in terms of words? It is likely, it is unlikely, it is more likely, or numbers, 20%, 30%, or even pictorial diagrams, related not just to how the probabilities that these convey, but also the trust that they convey in the person communicating the information to you. So in a nutshell, everything therefore does come back to this question of risk, with some more and less controversial topics in there, I guess. And why is this important for society? I'd like to hope that it's not the type of research that's that far removed from why it's important to society. So for example, if we think about the optimism question, it's often been thought that the reason that people don't take certain health protective behaviours is because they're optimistic, or they think they have some sort of unique invulnerability. I'm not going to get a heart attack, therefore I don't need to exercise and I can eat all the burgers I want. If that's not the case, then it might be that we need different interventions in order to address these questions. And in fact, personally, I think given that it seems as though negative events might be overestimated relative to neutral events, and I'm now engaging slightly more in speculation, it's possible that can lead to similar effects for almost the opposite reasons, which is a certain lack of agency. So if I think, well, actually heart attack is pretty likely to happen to me, and I overestimate that, I might think it doesn't make any difference if I eat bad food or I go for exercise. So I feel a sort of learned helplessness potentially from that. And I say, although learned helplessness is a well-established construct in psychology, I'm making a bit of a leap there. And of course, in terms of how we communicate risk information, that's important in a huge number of different areas. So currently collaborating with the British Geological Survey, looking at how we can communicate information about volcanic risk. For example, for people living in areas where there might be a volcanic eruption, and how far the lava might spread to guide things such as evacuation decisions. And I've also done some work looking at the communication policies of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who are very interested in how we can communicate uncertainty to people, because science is uncertain. Doesn't mean that science is wrong. Science is inherently uncertain. And if we can communicate that to people without losing their trust, then we're going to be in a much stronger position to get people to engage with the underlying scientific facts and findings.